think the deities of each pantheon, I guess, and their interaction with each other on a fairly, do they interact regularly on a regular basis? I have only heard this thing from eclectics. Thank you for your replies. So to his concept, I replied that I treat each pantheon and associated tradition as ultimately distinct from one another. Personally, I think that the domains of various gods and goddesses are overlapping, such as the ocean, the sky, various different places and concepts, in subtle ways which are difficult to define concretely. But I don't think that the idea of deities from separate pantheons, quote unquote, interacting is a useful spiritual concept. We polytheists, for the most part, believe the gods and goddesses exist as distinct entities within the cosmos, but spiritual concepts of deity that are too literalist run the risk of not only being too rigid in practice, but reduce the gods into mundane caricatures and draws away attention from the cultural nuances of the societies they spring from. And I ended by saying that I think that views like these, very literalist kind of silly views like this, are ultimately holdovers from the denigration of polytheistic traditions by monotheistic religions, most particularly Christianity and Islam, and are not a part of serious, dedicated polytheistic spirituality. But of course, that's only speaking from my perspective, and it's an editorialism ultimately.
I would agree with you. I believe on all points. But to me, a god is a personification of natural forces generally. It's a way to make it more human so that we can feel as if we're communicating, because it's hard to put a face on the wind and have a ceremony or ritual dedicated to it, showing your thanks, your prayers, or whatever your particular practices are. And it helps to view it as such. And I think that the differences that you see are mostly just cultural trappings, but that the wind is the wind, despite what name you give it, and various personality attributes. Yeah.
To a certain extent, I think I would agree with you on your sort of interpretation of what I said. If for nothing else, because ultimately polytheistic spiritualities are rooted in animism, the idea that there's spirits in everything, that everything is of spirit, which, I mean, there's almost sort of nuance and almost pedantic differences between a pantheistic worldview and an animistic worldview, at least in the minds of a lot of those in academia. I think they're different. They can coexist, but they don't necessarily have to.
I would say that I would say that I am at least a soft animist. I'm unclear where I stand on that, but I do find it consistent with my form of pantheism. Please proceed.
There's an extent that you see within traditional polytheistic religions that, regardless of what you believe, you almost have a sort of suspension of disbelief, that you enter into ritual with that level of devotion, with that certain level of belief, and allow experiences to happen through regular repetition of certain rituals and kind of coming to certain understandings. It's not to say that it's without thought, it's without consideration, but, and you really see this among the Greeks, it was a view that ritual was more of a time for quiet devotion, and that philosophy was the realm in which you would actually examine and make assertions, often contrary assertions to other people. And I think that also is reflected in the mythological tradition. You really see this in Greece, though not all of it has survived. There is definitely an extent that suggests that there would have been multiple different mythologies that would have been coexistent, not just in Greek culture as a whole, but from city-state to city-state and from community to community. So there was definitely an extent that they saw their own symbolisms as quite that way, symbolic. And I think that kind of concept, that level of flexibility while at the same time having structure, is something that's often lost in the conversation about modern religion.
Again, would have to agree, and I this time don't really have anything to add to that.
You mean you're not going to tear my head off and go off into a really, really long, great debate argument?
No, I will not do that. I
Oh, damn.
I really like. I see a lot of similarities between how I feel and a lot of polytheists feel. It's why I have no problems giving myself the pagan label because my beliefs are very nature centric, and I think that that's it, the most common thread amongst those who would use that label. I and I also see that my pantheistic view, if you cut it up into parts, becomes almost synonymous with polytheism. So I just don't go around giving everything a name. So maybe it's just from a lack of will more than a lack of belief.
I tend to feel that in conversations like these, and particularly ones having to do with the sorts of traditions that you and I are most familiar with, that broader terms are actually a lot more useful in some manner. They have to be specific enough to describe or at least hint at a specific tradition, but I think not getting into ultra narrow definitions is actually is quite a bit more useful. So, for instance, when people ask, I usually have two answers when they ask me what my beliefs are. I start with, and I was actually having this conversation a number of hours ago with a friend. Um, I tell people that I'm a Hellenic polytheist. Sometimes they'll ask what Hellenic is, but most people have an idea that that means Greek, and usually ancient Greek. And polytheist, most people can kind of construct that word, can make sense of that word as being multi gods. So usually that's as far as it goes. Sometimes they'll be like, huh? And then I'll say Hellenic or Greek pagan. And then when I use the term pagan, they kind of understand. Most people who wouldn't know the first and almost prefer to hear the second and can only make sense of the second wouldn't know enough about the second to know the difference between a Reconstructionist and an eclectic, or even really what paganism is or what neo-paganism as a whole. So I usually go with the most specific, but ultimately very broad, without getting into finer details, and then kind of go from there. But most of the time, it isn't really much of an issue, and the excessive amounts of labels that people ascribe to themselves they are really ridiculous.
And I also often give out details in a way that I get readings back from the person on how interested they're going to be on pursuing a more detailed explanation. Though I tend to say that no matter what my beliefs are, that it is better to see them in action and to get to know me, to know what my path is, because I think what comes from me is more important than what the beliefs themselves are. What the results are is more important to describe it. But
Oh, absolutely.
then we get down to the orthodoxy versus the orthopraxy. One one of your go-to topics.
And orthopathy, with the third one, which I would like to mention more often because a lot of esoteric traditions and even what one might consider to be orthodox traditions incorporate more orthopathy than they do actual orthopraxy. There's different levels and degrees to which those three focuses are exemplified in certain religions. But speaking to what you were saying about sort of demonstration, I can speak to that from experience, and particularly more recent experience, some of which I've explained here in chat. But um, I've started to interact a lot more with the larger pagan community, despite some of my reservations to the contrary. and making demonstrations, not just having discussion groups and putting out ideas, but particularly this last couple of months when I was able to actually do a full ritual demonstration of my tradition among people who haven't even heard of Reconstructionism or less Hellenic polytheistic Reconstructionism within the pagan community. I mean, this wasn't just a group of college students who had never even heard of paganism. But I'll tell you, just that one experience and actually giving them a full demonstration of what I do was far more useful than me going into the specifics or the pedantry of the differences between recon and eclectic or non-recon paganism.
Hello, Alfred.
Hey, Gabrielle, how you doing, buddy?
Not bad. How are you?
How's Greece? Still holding out?
Yeah, Greece is good. We're both sick, but Greece is still good.
I've been sick the last 2 days too. Maybe we caught something last time we were on Hangout.
Yeah, and if I actually believed we could transfer germs through the internet, I would support that as a theory.
If they ever figure out how to do that, then we're going to be in some serious trouble.
No kidding, huh?
All it takes is one guy to get Ebola and get out of Google Plus Hangout.
I don't know if I can bring myself to wear a headset that has a little condom wrapped around the microphone.
Yeah.
We must be getting closer to the winter months. We have people showing up.
I just left a Hangout that had 9 or 10 or 8 or whatever number of what sounded to me to be 15-year-old, Christian teenage, pimply faced, have no clue what's going on in the world people, and I can only hang there for so long. I'd go. So what's up? What are we talking about?
Where did we leave off?
We were sort of just talking about the excess of labels that are ascribed to people of different religious beliefs, but particularly among those who find themselves in alternative spirituality. It's to the point of excess where they're not even all that useful, particularly in more common interaction. If somebody asks you your belief in a very casual manner, as much as one could ask that question, it's best to leave things very open-ended because most people don't have the interest to really even go further with that, and it's kind of a wasted effort, I think.
What kind of labels?
Well, like in paganism, in neo-paganism, there's very specific traditions. I mean, to the point of like only a handful of people would even know that specific difference from a host of other different labels of traditions.
Hmm.
So I find that it's much more useful to use general terms that are also rather specific. So I was saying to Aberon that instead of saying that I'm a practitioner of Hellenismos, which is a Greek term for my tradition, I would just say I'm a Hellenic polytheist, which denotes Greek polytheism.
Right.
And that's usually as far as it needs to go. Most people won't ask more questions. Sometimes they won't know what that is, and I just say, okay, Greek pagan. And that's usually good enough, and it usually ends there. Most people who would not know the first term would likely be satisfied with the second and would not want to explore further than that. But the times in which that conversation even occurs in the real world is very, very slim.
Okay.
Usually it's people online who have more of an openness for some kind of conversation, debate, discussion, whatever the case may be.
Gotcha.
And I was just kind of mentioning different things I'm doing, interfaith organizations, discussion groups, all sorts of things, and trying to do more in the real world. Actually physically meeting up with people, because a lot of the conversations you can have person to person, face to face, particularly with individuals, but also in smaller groups, can be very advantageous. I mean, there's obviously advantages and disadvantages to both. I mean, obviously online you can get people from everywhere. within reason, obviously speaking at least the same language. But in face-to-face, you can get people who are local. You can get people that you could meet afterwards for a cup of coffee, that kind of thing. So you can have a whole host of different kinds of more intimate conversations by comparison. It's kind of interesting looking at the differences. And I was mentioning before, making certain demonstrations and actually giving more active explanations of my spiritual tradition has been very has had a level of respect and has had a level of understanding that I wouldn't otherwise have done just by giving links or book lists to people. Actually, them seeing what it looks like, they have a much better understanding of what it's actually about. It's similar to saying, oh, okay, here's a website of how to fix your car, how to change your spark plug, your oil, versus I'm going to actually sit down here and show you where everything is on your car. You can get a much better understanding when it's giving a more physical demonstration.
Yeah, sure. It's kind of interesting when you said that you try to, in general conversations, avoid being overly specific in terms of your spirituality, because most people don't know the difference anyway, or maybe the majority don't care. As an atheist, I find it to be almost the reverse problem. When I say I'm an atheist, I find actually that people think they know what that means, and they kind of run away with it. And I always find that I'm in a position of having to kind of pull them back and go, no, 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 that's not quite it. No. So interesting that the problems kind of mirror each other.
I think there's probably a few other labels that people jump to conclusions for, and it's probably like my trepidation with saying pagan is I think that there's definitely a few places people assume that what they make assumptions about what that means, that there are definitely stereotypes attached to it that don't necessarily apply to me, but yet I still feel that the label pagan applies to me.
Well, yeah, you say pagan like in the American South, and if people look at you because they think you sacrifice babies or something, ignorant shit like that.
Well, they would think that if I said I was an atheist as well, so whatever.
Yeah, actually, you're not far from the truth there. I worked with one girl one time. I remember this, and young black girl, and it was in South Carolina, and we were in the coffee room getting coffee break. And I had just started working there, and this, of course, it was in the South, it's South Carolina, so where do you go to church is like hi, how are you everywhere else. So hi, I go, and I said, oh, I'm an atheist, and I swear her eyes got the size of $50, as big as you could imagine them getting. And she goes, oh my God, you worship Satan. I'm so glad she didn't have a coffee cup, because then it would have been a movie moment. She would have dropped it and the coffee would have gone everywhere.
Yeah. Well, if you get people that don't have any idea of a culture outside of theirs, with a lot of the Christians who don't understand that someone might not believe in their God and or their devil.
Yeah.
Their assumption is anything that isn't what they are is the worship of their adversary. So, yeah. So, we all get that.
That's true. Yep.
But yeah, I don't know. Whatever my choices have been, I think one of the greatest things I liked is that my family was always supportive of it, and like I could talk to my grandmother, and if I was a member of a Druid Grove for a while, I gave that a try, and she would see that as just any other church, an alternative to the next church, and I really am glad I had that, because I don't think that a lot of people have families that would see it as being an equivalent thing to that, and just as valid.
I wonder, is that because, do you think, is it because there's instead of spirituality being individual spirituality, which I think is what it should be, is it because most people instead think of religion as more of having more social or social economic ties? In other words, it's on the same level with we drive Chevys and not Buicks, and we're blue collar workers, not white collar workers, and it's sort of an identity factor. And so when you step outside that, now there's some question as to, not that do you belong sort of in the nuclear family, but it does kind of maybe brings up weird barriers just because of the way religion is integrated.
I believe we kind of started the day out on the in-group, out-group kind of dynamics. I have found that when you get a lot, I don't know if I would always say that I found that you get a lot less of that with a lot of the pagan groups. And I haven't found out exactly if that's because a lot of that family of religions are more open to you not having to follow as stringently the rules, or the rules aren't written in such a way that they're not flexible, or if it's more, or it could be both, that when you're smaller groups of people, you have to accept a wider variety of ideas and thoughts to get your numbers up to anything that would seem to matter.
I think I can clarify this a little bit for you. If you look at older polytheistic beliefs, they're ultimately communal, and they were extensions of culture, but they were also very pluralistic. Multiple gods, multiple interpretations, multiple myths. There were certain principles, guiding principles, that were common to a particular culture's beliefs, but there was a considerable more amount of flexibility. What's interesting is that Christianity developed around a time, it's kind of a chicken and the egg sort of scenario. Christianity develops around at a time when imperialistic culture was on the rise. And one could also argue that imperialistic culture helped to form Christianity in the first place. But it could be the other way. Could be that Christianity forming helped to move along the idea of imperialistic culture. But as it stands, the early church, as it was becoming canonized, it was done in such a manner that it wasn't just a single culture's principles, but rather everyone. Everyone under the same sort of rule of the church, which was just really, if you really get down to it, a continuation of what Rome was after it fell. It was what Rome became after it evolved. So it's a culture of imperialism, a religion of imperialism.
I'm trying to recall, after you gave that explanation, I was trying to recall, I read a book, and the author had a chapter on basically that topic in that time period. I'm gonna have to read the book again now, because I can't really verbalize what she said, but I do remember that she kind of was making that, or contrasting it, I think, and if I remember right in hers, the notion that the Roman imperial religion at that time was a religion, but that it was also obedience or participation in that religion was seen more as it's just a thing that you do. It sort of would be like saying, that a person should pay their debts. It was just an obligation, but it was sort of, it had a non-spiritual, I guess, component to it, more of a civic component to it, and that there was a real clash when Christianity came about at that point, because now they saw their obedience to their religion as very exclusive to the point where the Romans now felt that this was a threat to government, to the status quo. It wasn't just another religion that you could kind of add to the imperial cult and say, well, I'm this, and I'll do my obligation to the imperial cult too, to Caesar. This was more of a very exclusive one that kind of threatened the stability. At least they saw it that way, of the government.
And it wasn't just a threat to the imperial cult, it was also a threat to the substratum of different religions that were recognized. In many different cities and townships, they would have had temple districts. They would have had a temple to this deity and a temple to that deity. They all would have had their own spaces in the same way that you'd have shops that were set up and paid taxes so that they could still be there. And clergy was very much in that way. I mean, in local areas, you could have been elected by your community to host certain rituals during certain festivals. But in much larger communities, in metropolitan areas, a clergy was a profession. You were a priest or a priestess. You were hired on and paid to perform certain functions as a part of society. You weren't given sort of status that we give bishops and popes in modern Christian religion, but you were given a certain authority over a particular area. So there were ways in which religion and economics sort of interacted, and there were certain assumptions that were made in polytheistic traditions where this is no declaration of truth, this is just where this is, and this is what we do here, and that's what you do over there. And when you have a exclusive monotheistic tradition saying this is what we do everywhere,
right?
Yeah, that is a much different scenario.
Well, there's it's an important point to point out that it was a certain, I guess, reform, I think, of Jesus' message and so on, when I think it was John, I don't remember, who gave the idea of the divine right to government, or to kings, to rule, and essentially destroyed what was a partial separation of church and state, which existed in Judaism. It existed in certain other areas. So it didn't exist amongst the Greeks or the Romans. The two are inseparable. It's about making Christianity something that could be give rights to the religious right to the kings, and the kings would have a certain level of rule over religion in worldly matters. So the kingship of two realms, it's sometimes called. Yeah, God is the king of the heavens, and there's humans on earth who are kings, and they have control over all matters of the earth. There's certain things like this, certain ideas like this. You had, therefore, that caused this the advantage that Christianity had amongst Romans, and because the rulers could use it, as opposed to, let's say, in Judaism, the temple cult, the priest was completely independent of all the two other branches of Jewish government, and since that's the case, they couldn't be overridden by a king. A king who happened to be a priest wasn't allowed to serve in the temple. So there was a separation between the clergy and the governance, whereas with this at the early beginning, this sort of reform basically gave Christianity a huge advantage in that it was, I think, at the time the only it was the only monotheistic religion that gave kings divine right, whereas at the same time Judaism was very popular and it didn't do that at all, and that scared the Roman kings.
And it's been said before, and I think it bears mentioning, this concept, this interaction between divine right of kings and of priests really did set the stage for centuries later when feudalism became such a prominent aspect of what we would consider to be Europe. The evolution of Europe really is built off of that interaction between kingship and priesthood.
Yeah.
They always show this diagram when you look at world history, and particularly the history of the Middle Ages, a triangle with a sort of church and God at the top, and then you're having bishops and and you have lords and kings and all that kind of stuff, and it goes down all the way to serfs at the very, very bottom, being the largest portion of the population with the least amount of rights and least amount of wealth.
Right.
But that's
I
not
mean,
to say
it's
that you
actually.
didn't have.
Yeah, sorry, go on. Actually, when there was the independence war of America, so there were some religious Christians were stating that you can't oppose it because the British king had divine right. That's why there was some some of the founders said on this basis they said that we're not a Christian nation because we don't believe in divine right of government. They may have believed in Jesus, may have believed in a lot of aspects of Christianity, but they didn't want to take the name Christian because of the problem of divine right. I don't know a huge amount about it. I just remember coming across this idea.
All I was going to say before is that's not to say that there weren't tiered systems of governance. There were people that had the great deal of power with people underneath having very, very little. I mean, even early Greek democracy was built around a sort of oligarchic style of government. Even though we're ultimately developed out of democratic governments in the developed world, it's evolved considerably from its earlier form, where at the time you had to have been a citizen, you had to have been male and over a certain age, you had to have owned property, you needed to oftentimes been born in that area. So it was very restricted, and even an early American government was built around similar ideals. And when we were first founding this nation, there were considerations to make George Washington a king, and they went against that. It's interesting to see. I mean, if that wouldn't have occurred, if they would have actually made George Washington a king, imagine how different the American government would have been.
God,
Yeah.
yes. I'm not sure which would have been scarier, King Trump or King Palin. Queen Palin, excuse me.
I think they would have he would have outright opposed it, even if people gave him on a platter to be a king. All the founding fathers were exceedingly libertarian-minded, so yeah, it's interesting. There's some very interesting points in the whole divine right thing because it takes some very serious and very creative, I guess, interpretations of the Old Testament and the New Testament, parts of the New Testament, sorry, Jesus and all that. It takes a very serious, a very creative rereading in order to even allow these things. Just the same way, just like they did some very creative exegesis to bring the idea of a holy war into Christianity with the Crusades. That was entirely against the basic meanings and understandings of the New Testament. Part of the whole point of Christianity was that it rejected what it saw to be the Old Testament love of holy war, and then come along and they just see the problem is with hierarchic systems where you have some sort of authority is that all these the nice altruistic good values become very hard to keep, because as soon as you have authority, people are going to abuse it. When you have hierarchy, like theoretically in Judaism and Islam both, there's not supposed to be hierarchy. It just happens to be in Islam there is, and in Judaism nowadays, of course, we don't have our ideal system. But in the ideal system, even the great court, which can decide on all matters of Jewish law, they can rule a king. They can judge a king or any other government, and also they can, even if they make a mistake, and you're let's say you're a legal scholar, like you know Jewish law, and you know that they made a mistake, you're actually obligated to not listen to them, and if you do, you become liable. So, for example, this idea where there is no final authority is the biggest, anti when it's anti-hierarchical, when you don't have a hierarchy, so you can actually keep all the values, such as not having religious war and not giving divine right to a ruler. All these things can't happen when there's no hierarchy. So I think it's got to do with, it's in general, it's a point about human nature and corruption. I have a Assyrian friend. I just met with him yesterday, and we touched on this point, and he said that the Assyrian Church, we said how the Assyrian Church, if it could somehow de-hierarchize, which it is to an extent because of the diaspora, where there's a lot more independence, then it's a better thing. I think in general, it's being more and more accepted that this is the way for religions to go nowadays.
Yeah, there's an entire tractate in the Talmud that deals with mistakes that the Sanhedrin made.
That's right, Horayot, yeah.
Yeah, I learned it in yeshiva a little bit.
Yeah. And where it says over there that someone who knows the law is not allowed to listen to them when they make mistakes. Yeah. So there's no final absolute authority. The
Right.
people are the authority. Because they're not even allowed to rule without the assent of the people. Like you can't have a great court without assent of the people.
Right.
Well, I guess with that large bit of silence, I have to regrettably leave for tonight. Thank you all for having me in here. I'm glad we got a few faces I'm not familiar with, and I could hear you all speak.
My pleasure. It was good to finally join in, After being invited so many times, I never had time.
Even if I only got to see you for like 20 minutes, but I'm sure there'll be more time in the future. So.
Definitely.
All right.
See you
I
then.
hope so too.
Bye.
See you.
Take care.
I'm gonna go as well. I have to finish a calligraphy project. Yeah, but it was good. I should do this more often.
Definitely.
For sure.
You're always welcome back.
All right, thank you. I'll see you all.
Take care.
Bye.